So greetings everyone and welcome to Ion Africa. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center. And Ion Africa is our weekly seminary series. We're very delighted today to have Dr. Lauren Jarvis as our guest speaker. Before I hand it over to her, a brief introduction. Dr. Jarvis is an Associate Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is interested in the history of the economic transformation, as well as its many social and cultural consequences in 19th and 20th century South Africa. In her first book, A Prophet of the People, Isaiah Shembe and the Making of a South African Church, her first book, A Prophet of the People, Isaiah Shembe and the Making of a South African Church, re-examines the life of one of the African continent's most famous prophets to show how Shembe and his community refracted the cleavages, limits, and possibilities of an industrializing South Africa. He is now conducting research for a book about how people in South Africa have pushed back against economic inequality from 1800 to the present. Thank you so much for being here. We're glad to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. MSU has such a storied African Studies Center that I'm really delighted to be here. And I am especially grateful to Awa and Andy and the other people who made this visit possible. So thank you. Okay, just advance this. So in this photograph, the seated man's name was not yet, but would soon become Isaiah Shembe. And trying to figure out the context of this photograph, taken in a small town in South Africa, sometime between 1906 and 1909, was one puzzle piece as I thought about the bigger set of ideas I want to present to you today. These ideas are drawn from my recent book, mentioned by Awa, A Prophet of the People, published with MSU Press earlier this year. Now, for scholars of many disciplines, Isaiah Shembe is the best known Christian prophet, not just in South Africa, but perhaps on the whole African continent. What more do we have to learn about him and the Nazareth Church that he founded? I should say this is a question I asked myself many, many times as I struggled to finish this book. But I came to think that despite the terrific work by Liz Gunner, Joel Cabrita, and Kosinati Sitole, and others, that there was more to learn, that we had misunderstood or not fully explored how Shembe's life refracted South Africa's industrialization and unification, and as a result, exposed enduring features of 20th century South Africa. One of those features, the one I want to explore today, is a link between Christianity and evasion, what I'm calling hide and sneak Christianity. So in this photograph, I think that the soon-to-be Shembe is in a disguise, an ensemble that hides or obscures his intentions and that makes him look like one more African man traveling in search of migrant work, even though his main intention involved spreading the gospel. I will talk more about this photograph and why I think he had reasons to hide his intentions. But I want to turn now for a moment to the concept of evasion. It is not one we typically associate with religious change on the African continent, but evasion has deep roots in Christianity, as well as many other faiths that incubated amid persecution. And evasion, whether tied to Christianity or not, has deep roots in South Africa because of the country's history of violence, its varied zones of authority, and the limits its governments placed on people because of race, ethnicity, gender, generation, education, religion. The list could go on and on. And so this talk suggests an understanding of evasion that includes efforts to avoid conflict, detection, or punishment by hiding often only partially, someone's intentions, actions, or physical presence. Evasion includes then the strategic use of language and words. One might think of the canonical "I do not recall" from a witness, as well as patterns of mobility and elements of identity, including the use of clothes, names, behaviors, and actions. Evasion, as I see it, has a complicated relationship with the idea of truth, especially since people often deploy strategies of evasion to reveal partial truths without being fully dishonest. Indeed, evasion can reveal truths to some, even as it hides the truth from others. And evasion imbricates in time and place, and as a result becomes a powerful lens for refracting authority, conflict, and experiences of daily life. Because evasion often involves foresight and sometimes also justification, it can also be, as we will see, a powerful lens for refracting morality. So with the rest of my time in this talk, I'm going to consider pieces of evidence that open up examples of evasion at different phases of Shembe's life and is in his encounter with Christianity. And I'm going to wrap up with what I see as some implications for thinking about Shembe, the Nazarene Church, and South Africa more broadly. This first example is a snippet of testimony. So just after my arrival at Boss Conrad's home, it came to me to go and pray alone towards dusk as the light was failing. I went to pray by a rocky outcrop to the east of the boss's home. I arrived and knelt. This is from an account of Shembe telling his spiritual autobiography to an inquiring colonial administrator in 1927. By then, Shembe was a church leader and a famous man, even a celebrity. He might indeed have had reasons to tell his life story differently to a white official like the one listening to him, but his life had been the source of his preaching for many decades, and key elements of it had crystallized. And one element that had crystallized was of him talking about in his boyhood, sneaking around to find a place to pray. And indeed, just after these words in the interview, he explained how when he was discovered in this spot by the rocky outcrop, he found another better hiding spot where people could not find him. Shembe was, at the time he described, probably in his early teens. He and his family were living as labor tenants on a white-owned farm in the Orange Free State, in this area with this big green circle that you can see on the screen, but outside of the town of Harrismith. Such arrangements often involved African boys approaching or in their early teens, going away to work for white farmers for several months at a time. And in this case, the white farmer for whom Shembe went to work offered the young Shembe his most sustained exposure to Christianity. And Shembe began to try out rituals such as prayer and hymn singing soon after arriving, albeit in a context in which he did not want other people to know. Certainly not other African children who could perhaps get word back to his parents, and perhaps not even the white farmer whom he emulated. White farmers in this region often preferred tenant families who were not Christians. Now, teenagers sneaking around seems pretty normal to me, but I want to suggest that hiding and sneaking was a regular feature of the mission encounter. Foreign missionaries brought with them ideas of an omniscient God who saw all, even what was hidden to others. They themselves sometimes snuck away to pray and facilitated others' efforts to evade as they sought to win converts. But importantly, evasion emerged from the pattern of how missionaries and Africans interacted. Early on in the 19th century, some Africans rejected the missionary message outright. But over time, many Africans developed public ways of engaging with missionaries without converting, to take the good without what they saw as the bad. So missionaries also began to prioritize groups of people with less social authority: children, women fleeing unwanted marriages, people who in some ways were already more punishable if they were caught doing this thing that other people might not want them to do. And so this drove expressions of interest in Christianity underground in many instances. Missionaries noted this. They complained about how many people came to their stations for sermons on Sunday for the good bargains or trade deals that they hoped to receive on Monday. And some missionaries even noted too that in contrast, the real believers, this is a quote from a missionary, hide themselves among the trees, in the recesses of the rock, or in the depths of the ravine, and from thence cry in the simple language of one of their hymns, "Give us, Lord, thy favor." So for Shembe, after about a year of his working for this white farmer, he took his hiding and sneaking, we had seen with the story of the prayer, and he went public to his parents. He refused meat offered to the ancestors as part of a sacrifice as one indication of his interest in Christianity. And he explained in the same interview in 1927 that his father never had any quarrel with him over that. But if Shembe had space to openly defy his parents as a teenager, he lost some of it when his father died. And I think this is really important for how we imagine the authority of African patriarchs. As Shembe described it, his faith had to go back underground when he began to marry and have children. And this related to the systems of land tenure in the Orange Free State and the preference for large polygynous families, as well as pressures from his own family to sustain his lineage and chiefdom and to find ways to provide for his mother and his younger siblings too. So as Shembe described his life, his faith went back underground for about 15 years, during a period when, by many metrics, he did very well. He married 3 wives and was in negotiations at one point to marry a 4th. He secured a place on the farm, in fact, the same farm with the farmer where he had learned about prayer and him singing in the first place. And he navigated the upheaval of the South African War, ending up being forcibly removed and then ending up back in a place where he was able to keep his herds and grow his crops. But a series of disasters that seemed to broadcast Shembe's sins, seemed to make Shembe's sins public, led to a breaking point when he was around 40. Despite his ample herds and successful crops and reputation as a talented farmer, he had this terrible experience of 10 of his 16 children dying, and the deaths of 3 older boys. And so these 10 over 16 out of 16 is over many years, but there's this period when 3 older boys, 3 boys that had survived infancy, were between 8 and 12 or so, died in a matter of weeks. And this is what Shembe said made him decide to leave the farm and his family and to live openly as a Christian. The idea that sin and sickness were linked and that this might show up in the deaths of children was one component of a divine healing revival sweeping through the region in the first decade of the 20th century. One carried by people on horseback, foot, and cart crisscrossing through. Some of them even snuck onto white-owned land and preached to farm tenants like Shembe. And the same revival taught that anyone with a story to tell of God's healing should share it. And Shembe said he took this idea from the farm to the nearest town, Harrismith, determined to share the gospel. So this brings us back to the photograph with which I opened and to which I keep returning. So this is almost certainly from Harrismith and taken sometime between 1906 and 1909, at a time when Shembe had just left the farm, moved to town, and was working as a night soil collector, a sewage collector, literally collecting buckets of human excrement. In his free time, and this was one of the perks of the job, if we can say it had any, and it certainly came with more free time than he had had on the farm, he was probably already preaching, but without much success, in part because there were already so many African Christians in towns such as Harrismith. Indeed, the segregated townships of these small towns had become incubators of African Christianity by the early 20th century, with the majority of African town dwellers already claiming membership in a church by the time Shembe moved to town. The man standing is William Lashega, a Baptist minister engaged in his own strategy of evasion on display in the photo. Lashega had served as a Baptist evangelist for nearly a decade, but had a few years before this photograph was taken, lost his affiliation with a group of white Baptist patrons on South Africa's industrializing Rand near Johannesburg. As he regrouped, he had stretched some truths to secure a special pass reserved for ordained ministers that would let him take the train more easily amid South Africa's thicket of laws monitoring Africans' mobility. And so to be clear, even though Leshega had been doing the work of a formally ordained minister, there is no evidence that he was formally ordained. But as Leshega readied to ride the rails to evangelize, he dressed the part, the suit, the clerical collar. You can maybe barely see it in this picture too, but he also has reading glasses draped around his neck. One more sign of his experience of mission education. Now, William Leshega deserves a book about him too, but he revealed how some mission-educated African Christians had an effective toolkit for evading state authority. His ability to read and write helped him craft strategically worded letters to new potential missionary sponsors and with their assistance to government officials. It also helped him scout out mission fields. As he did, Leshega tended to look for other people like him as he attempted to plant branches of his Baptist church. He looked for people who could also craft a letter to a magistrate that might assess potential danger or see what was allowed. Harrismith and the region more broadly, with its large community of African Christians, gave him a big pool to draw from, and a pool of people too who might be interested in the Baptist message of rebaptism by full immersion. It was also under temporary military rule, flooded with people from the countryside after the South African War, and full of officials complaining about overwork. It was, in other words, a pretty good spot to hide from authority. Still, Shembe didn't have the toolkit that Leshega often looked for. In Shembe's own words, he could not read except a little from the Bible, which had come to him by a miracle. Nor could he speak much English, another hallmark of people like Leshega that had helped them navigate the state. But I suspect that Shembe got a break and got a role in Leshega's church, in part because he and Leshega and perhaps others in their Baptist circles realized that different regions of South Africa held out potential for different strategies of evasive evangelism. The Baptist mission newsletters, to which Leshega sometimes wrote with updates, had stories about the plight of Baptist evangelists not too far from Harrismith in the neighboring British colony of Natal. These evangelists had used some of the same strategies as Leshega, but when a white official thought something was suspicious about Leshega, that official usually just answered with a polite rejection. Your request is not possible. But in Natal, by contrast, where the state had taken the harshest approach toward curbing the spread of Christianity among Africans, officials greeted letters sort of assessing what might be possible in a mission field from African Christians with efforts to get those African Christians removed. And so this earlier wave of African Baptist evangelists in Natal had been, their polite declines had been met with efforts to find them and get them out of the colony. And they had been successfully kicked out. One had reportedly died attempting to navigate his trouble with state officials as well. So in light of this knowledge, this reservoir of experience, Leshega, Shembe, and others made a plan for Shembe to enter Natal, not as an African evangelist who would inspire ire, but as someone who would, on the surface, be welcomed by state officials, as an African man seeking wage work in Durban. And in fact, this category of people, or a person, was so desirable in Natal that the government held out certain rewards to people who fell in it. An African man coming from outside of Natal's borders, claiming to seek work in Durban, got an inward pass that allowed use of the train for a whole year. Now, one still had to pay for tickets, but the special pass, but one didn't have to go to approach the magistrate to get a pass for each train journey, which was a requirement for Africans in many other parts of South Africa at this time. And part of why it had mattered that Leshega had framed himself as an ordained minister. He had gotten that permission because of his formal status or perceived formal status. So we can imagine Shembe, sometime shortly after this picture was taken, going to the border station, claiming to be a work seeker and dressed in fairly ordinary clothes. We know that he gave the first name of Jan or John, a transnational exemplar of male anonymity. I was going to struggle with that in the talk. At least once to get an N-word pass into Natal. And he would have gotten on the train too, knowing that he had 1 year to use the trains as much as he could want, as long as he would afford it. And perhaps also knowing that African men regularly returned to the pass office at border stations, gave different names, and then got another free year of riding the train. The plan for Shembe revealed the layers of truth and authenticity that a good disguise might contain. True, his plain clothes in this photograph made him look ordinary, but his clothes were also an indication that Shembe was different from many African evangelists who had come before him, that he did not have the skills that came with a mission education. Moreover, given Shembe's dogged work habits, it was possible that he did plan to pick up casual labor in Durban to support himself. Framing himself as another potential work seeker was not entirely false. And some of the elements of disguise allowed for multiple interpretations and plausible deniability too. The bag he carried, for example, might look to some just like another traveling bag, or to others like a doctor's bag, a symbol a symbol that broadcasted the claims to heal that he would make. I spent a lot of time looking at pictures of doctor's bags from the early 20th century to try to assess this. I think we could say this could look to some like a doctor's bag. But depending on who asked, he could say one thing or another. As healers in Natal faced restrictions as well. So to some, the doctor's bag might raise red flags too. And perhaps it was within this bag that Shembe kept something else that could reveal to some, but not all. Maybe this very photograph, and also a certificate indicating his place with the Baptist Church of Harrismith, documentation for people who could read or who could not about his affiliations and deeper purpose he could take out as needed. I also just want to flag here too, just how much the idea of conversion could overlap with the idea of disguise at this point in South Africa's history. So missionaries often demanded that African Christians, or as they were assessing conversion among African Christians, they looked for many markers of religious change, some external and public facing, some not. But ideas of conversion and disguise could support taking a new name, buying new clothes, seeking a new occupation, finding new accessories, going new places. These were all things that Shembe did as he readied to go on this mission and as he began living in a way that could make his faith public, if ironically, he realized that he would still have a lot to hide as he did. So to wrap this example up, Shembe got a break. He got a position in someone else's church, not only because of his compelling story of salvation or his dogged work ethic. Here was a man willing to, collect sewage for a living while also preaching on the side, but also because he was a good fit for a strategy of evasion that reflected the needs and demands of one part of South Africa. And so let us now turn to how things went when he got there. Okay, so example 3. I will read this out just because I know that with my students, when I don't, everybody's reading it while I'm talking. So this is from Evangelism Natal, newspaper founded and edited by John Dubé, famous politician and thinker, an important person in South Africa more broadly. But this snippet of this letter from 1915 says, I am amazed by barren women who, after being prayed for by Shembe, today they are mothers. On January 14th in 1915, Shembe was blessing these children who were born after he prayed for their mothers, praying in the name of God. We are witnessing God's miracles. These miracles are happening for the nation to see that God exists, the same God who appeared to Elisha and the woman of Shunem. Okay. So some of Shembe's early converts were literate and used the newspaper, and especially letters to the editor, to publicize Shembe's miracles and describe church events. This one from 1915 was about 2 years after Shembe had split with the Baptists and founded his own church. By that point, William Lashega was a member of the Apostolic Faith Mission, but again, that's another story. But this excerpt might seem obscure at first, but it actually reveals a great deal about what Shembe had done to get to the point of founding a church of his own, as well as how strategies of evasion had underpinned his efforts. The plan that Lashega and Shembe had hatched didn't seem to work very well. In Durban, Shembe found himself in the crosshairs, not only of some of the most strict laws monitoring African Christians, what his disguise had prepared him for, but also some of the most strict laws in South Africa monitoring African men living in the city, what his disguise depended upon. Policing in Durban meant that an outrageous portion of African men had been fined or sent to jail. And this is proportionally more, I mean, we think of things like this in Johannesburg, but in fact, there were more men fined and sent to jail in Durban than in Johannesburg or in any other city in South Africa at this time. But if all of this made launching a mission difficult in Durban, what Shembe was able to do was make connections to people who could help him decide his next destination. He met African Baptist men doing migrant work who had been converted by that earlier generation of African Baptists who had been kicked out. And Shembe soon ended up in their rural home. So he pushed into the hills of the rural chiefdoms, northeast of the city of Durban. Even if those hills made it easier to hide from white state officials, there were many angry parties he might encounter there. Members of other churches in this bastion of Christian Christianity, those worried about how this single unattached man might behave in a place with so many other men gone, people suspicious of peddlers with things to sell passing through the countryside, people worried about goat theft, something Shembe was accused of in this region. And more broadly, this region was also one that had just experienced, a few years before Shembe's arrival, a short burst of total warfare and what was known as the Bambata Rebellion. And the region's chiefs had seen the powers of the state to make new winners and losers, and the people of the region realized how the state's authority was spotty, but could also be devastating. And so when Shembe entered this area, homesteads were struggling to recover from the violence and looting that had taken place. This would be a special problem for Shembe because he would need their support to feed himself and to keep pushing into the countryside. So in this charged setting, one can see Shembe's efforts to avoid conflict and how he approached land use for worship, in the rumors that swirled about his approach to healing, and in so much else. But also, as he navigated this new microclimate of risks and possibilities, we get perhaps the first instance of the most common miraculous claim about Shembe, that he cured infertility and childlessness. And that's not from the example in 1915, what I'm referencing now. This is an earlier example. But in this earliest instance, it was not about him making this promise to someone who joined his church or someone who sought Shembe's healing, but someone who offered him water and a place to sit and protection from a group of angry men who had been chasing him. These were some of the angry men who accused him of stealing a goat. But the people who offered him water, who helped him evade danger, a Nazareta oral tradition suggests, so a story preserved by the church and its members, suggested that this family who had given him shelter had no children, but because of their kindness to Shembe, they would go on to have 3 sons. If the promise to cure infertility was initially a promise linked to Shembe's efforts to navigate the countryside and find safe harbors, it quickly became something that got other people moving to him. At a handful of homesteads and on snippets of common land offered by a few chiefs, people began to show up in larger numbers at his services, including groups of women traveling with others from the denominations they were already in, so Wesleyans, Congregationalists. There's this long mission history in this region. They began to come to his healing services too. And I can't tell the whole story of why and how today, but as the letter to the editor suggests, by 1915, there were enough people who credited their children to Shembe that he could show off babies as evidence of his miracles, right? This is one thing that's happening at these services. without dismissing the real and understandable anxieties about infertility in this region, with men gone, with homesteads ravaged by warfare, with food insecurity a real problem, and new patterns of disease and all kinds of things. I also want to suggest that infertility was a problem that could help others avoid conflict and evade too, especially women. Infertility was the kind of problem that could link interests across gender and generation in a household. It was also the kind of problem that, under most circumstances, took many months to see results. Thus, whether women experienced friction about their attendance at Shembe's services because they were members of other churches, or because their families were opposed to the spread of Christianity, or because of the pervasive associations between women's mobility and their sexual immorality, the claim that they were traveling to cure infertility helped create a permission structure for their movement, and one that lasted potentially many months, long enough at least to assess if Shembe's healing had worked. The letter to the editor from 1915 also suggests how curing infertility had links to the Bible. There are several Old Testament accounts that connect hosting a stranger to miraculous births. One of the most explicit is referenced here in 2 Kings. The woman of Shunem, I think I have the Bible quote here. Yeah, I pulled it. The woman of Shunem makes for the prophet Elijah a room. So this, let us make a small room on the roof with walls and put there for him a bed. So as the prophet Elisha is traveling through, the woman of Shunem says she will always host him. And in this story as well, the woman of Shunem, who had been childless, then has a son. And as a blessing in the Bible, the prophet Elisha later raises the son from the dead after he is ill as well. Now, it is worth considering more broadly how moving to the countryside offered Shembe new strategies of asserting resemblance. As Shembe began to gain a following in the region, his clothes, his migrant worker garb took on different meaning. They did not necessarily help him blend in as they had in Durban, but they marked him as someone going against the more common direction of movement, into rural areas, not out, and toward people left behind. But a setting of wilderness and mountains and his efforts to cross through them, this backdrop and his behaviors gave him ways to emulate examples in the Old Testament. Indeed, in Ndwedwe, Shembe's promises to cure infertility and childlessness opened up another dimension of evasion, one that blurred disguise with performance and self-fashioning. It would be easy but wrong, I should say, to interpret Shembe's reenactments cynically, to understand them as ploys meant to deceive. It is also impossible to know, especially at first, how much Shembe intentionally followed these scripts and how much some of his early literate converts mapped biblical scripts onto his activities as they evangelized for him. But over time, it does seem as though following Old Testament examples did indeed hide or compensate for something: Shembe's limited formal education and experience with Christianity. Reenactment and borrowing offered one way to show knowledge and commitment without reading. And indeed, the church that Shembe soon founded in this rural region made such reenactments not just the stuff of showy displays that bolstered Shembe's prophetic claims, but also of daily life for ordinary church members too. These ideas were central to the founding of the Nazareta Church as a separate denomination in 1913. Even the name Nazareta, which we might think of as Nazareth, and it will, it's not, that was initially what I thought, and I had to learn, it is actually a reference to Nazarite in the book of Judges, and the Nazarite vow, which offers specific rules or ways of acting for consecrating oneself unto God in order to receive special protection. In many parts of the Bible, the Nazarite vow is also linked to miraculous births. This is from Samuel all the way to John the Baptist. Thus, the claim to cure infertility, as well as how people responded, suggests one way that experiments in evasion, reenactment, resemblance, and disguise had changed Shembe's theology in the countryside. Now, our final example. So here, Shembe is out in the open, dancing, clearly with a photographer present. How does this involve hiding and sneaking? We might ask. I want to suggest that perhaps paradoxically, transparency and even celebrity were tied to strategies of evasion for Shembe in the last 15 years of his life, and that in this photograph, he was hiding in plain sight as he tried to evade not detection, but punishment. The Nazareth Church grew for nearly a decade without much interference from the state. After Union in 1910, the regional anxiety about African Christians waned, but Shembe had also done a good job of avoiding conflict, so he had stayed out of trouble. His strategies had worked. But then several events beginning in the early 1920s made the status quo impossible to maintain. The first was the standoff and then massacre of African Christians called the Israelites at Bulhoek in 1921, killed more than 100 people. And although this took place in the Cape, it left local officials in many parts of South Africa determined to learn about and better manage the African Christian communities that had sprung up over the past decade. In Natal, the Nazareta were high on the list. But if initially it was Nazareta resemblance to another community that attracted the state's attention, the Nazareta found ways to stay in the state's focus without wanting to. In the 1920s, the South African government attempted to influence more of the lives of its citizens and subjects, including in matters of public health. This clashed with the Nazareta commitment to avoid any medicine but God's and to avoid vaccination in particular. In 1926, a dramatic standoff took place near the very site of this photograph between government vaccinators and members of the Nazareta Church. And in that standoff, few church members accepted vaccination. Those who did were kicked out of the church. But these events put Shembe on notice. Given what had happened at Bulhoek, these events left him preparing his congregation for the possibility of disaster as state officials engaged in protracted conversations about next steps and tried to figure out how to manage this situation. As state scrutiny and threats grew, Shembe looked for new places to hide. Already by the early 1920s, the Nazareta had been pushing into southern Zululand. By the mid-1920s and early 1930s, Shembe himself was spending much more time there, and especially in Mtunzini and in Pangeni, these southern districts that you can see are attached by railway on this map. So the border with Zululand provided an administrative zone that still mattered and made it hard for administrators in the capital of Natal to track him. Even local officials had a hard time knowing what Shembe was doing in this region. Southern Zululand itself had some of the most poorly trained white officials. It was not a hub of Zulu royal authority and therefore had less state surveillance. And it had endemic malaria that perhaps kept more state officials in their offices. And indeed, local officials in Southern Zululand did not realize the extent of Shembe's activities in the region until 5 years after he had died, and therefore nearly 2 decades after his evangelism in Southern Zululand had begun. So they sort of knew he was there, but they didn't know exactly what he was doing or how often he was there. But whatever potential Southern Zululand held open to Shembe, the broader climate of danger and vulnerability shaped his engagement with its people. In Southern Zululand, polygyny was more prevalent and cattle herds more abundant than in Natal, especially among the region's chiefs. The Nazareta were already by this point more permissive than some churches regarding ideas about marriage and custom. But as Shembe began spending more time in Zululand, this permissiveness grew. Sermons from the 1920s suggest that the church came to accept polygyny under certain circumstances and became more involved in bride wealth negotiations, even offering cattle loans to fathers of daughters on the presumption of future bride wealth. These changes were controversial for some within the church and demanded compromises. And Shembe even framed some of them as grudging concessions, but they reflected the influence of Southern Zululand in a time of trouble. Still, Shembe could not hide everywhere. To return to this photograph at Ekupagameni, church headquarters, this was on private land that Shembe had bought. It was surveyed, it was registered, it was mappable. And these were some of the reasons why it had been chosen for the vaccination campaign in 1926. This land was also important in Nazareth's sacred geography and not abandonable. So I think that Shembe tried to protect himself when he had to be on this land. through crowds and spectacle. Crowds grew to include larger numbers of Nazareth church members, many who made the journey by train from southern Zululand, and other important people who could attract visitors. The Zulu king was often invited, for example. Sometimes he showed up, sometimes he didn't, but the idea that he might be there got a lot of people to come to these events. And in the late 1920s, just as this trouble with the state is really crystallizing, the crowds began to include white tourists, as well as some of the same white state officials who might have issued an order to proceed with another inoculation campaign or to arrest Shembe for his vaccination resistance. To grow these crowds, the Nazareth relied upon transportation infrastructure, the train, automobiles, an expanding network of roads. And for important chiefs and white tourists, cars marked status and facilitated movement to Equipagamene. So did growing notions of cultural tourism that provided a script for white people from Durban to make the journey out to Equipagamene as well. Now, to be clear, Shembe and the Nazareth did not cut this from whole cloth. Crowds had long mattered as one index of Shembe's authority. The Nazareth had begun dancing nearly a decade before white tourists started showing up, and many kinds of outsiders had long been welcomed at church headquarters. But it is telling, nevertheless, that in the 1920s and early 1930s, other groups of Africans experiencing trouble with the state began to use dance performances to try to smooth over bumpy relations. Thus, by building on what the Nazareth had already been doing, dancing, attracting large, varied crowds, Shembe could minimize some risks in the places where the government knew he would be. So consider the intertwined messages Shembe sent and layers of protection that he received by welcoming so many people to church events at Equipagamene. At these events, he could perform transparency. If so many people were welcome, what did he have to hide? But he also gained more witnesses if the state did decide to act, including white South Africans with connections to different media networks and audiences. And the sheer volume of the crowd suggested something about Shembe's authority, but it also must have caused headaches for officials worried about crowd control. And state officials seemed to realize this. One fretted about the difficulty of how to manage Shembe and the Nazareth, saying in 1931 that Shembe was, quote, no ordinary run of small prophet who conducts his doings in secret. He holds religious dances and other ceremonies to which Europeans are freely invited and which are given considerable prominence in the press. Still, by the time of Shembe's death in 1935, state officials were considering how they could escalate their pressure campaign and find punishments that would be effective despite Shembe's strategies. His unexpected death reset the conversation and made these problems the inheritance of his son and successor, Johannes Galilee Shembe. It would be easy as a result to look back on these years and see them as a remarkable success as Shembe navigated minefields. And he had largely avoided punishment while drawing more people into his church and becoming one of the wealthiest Africans in all of South Africa. Also another story that we can talk about. But his death offers hints of some of the costs. He died returning from a tour of Zululand. The descriptions of fever and headaches and the timing at the end of the rainy season make one wonder if he died of the malaria that was endemic in the region. Thus, if the region that had provided necessary shelter had also caused real harm. So, to begin wrapping up, I have shown how evasion intertwined with Shembe's experience of Christianity at every phase of his life, as a young person experimenting with the faith, as an evangelist hoping for a mission placement, as the founder of a new church, and as a prophet with renown. There was so much about South Africa that facilitated evasion, an ill-equipped state, shifting legal regimes as South Africa consolidated, the presence of different legal zones that sat side by side, despite that consolidation, different permissions given to different kinds of people living side by side too. All of this had the potential to make people question the purpose and efficacy of the laws. What is more, African Christians were not the only people who evaded. But I would like to suggest that Christianity contributed to patterns of evasion, patterns that often started at home as people became Christians in defiance of their parents, but also through ideas of conversion that could resemble disguise, and the idea of an all-knowing, all-seeing God who offered a different source of authority and morality. And as we think too about the different answers that African Christian communities arrived at about dance, about marriage, about bride wealth, I want to suggest that strategies of evasion shaped answers about these questions in the Nazareth Church. The need to find safe shelters from the state to avoid conflict with patriarchs. These were all driving factors that helped explain why the Nazareta arrived at different commitments than other churches. Later, these different answers became a way of celebrating rural African traditions in the Nazareth Church, but I do not think they necessarily started out that way, or at least not in a straightforward way. Following threads of evasion suggest something else about the politics of the Nazareth Church, too. Indeed, the prevalence of evasion and even outright defiance suggests stances much more complicated than a political acquiescence or even a symbolic politics. This is something closer to what South African historian Shula Marks described as the politics of the mask, or what James Scott would call a hidden transcript. We have had a hard time identifying the politics of these churches, in part because that was the point. And then finally, about South Africa and perhaps beyond. A racist, violent state made evasion a regular feature of life for many South Africans. Over the 20th century, some of the most successful campaigns to protest that state involved taking evasion that was part of daily life and turning it into open defiance, announcing we are going to do this when people had already been avoiding paying taxes or had already been sneaking into places where they were not supposed to be, or violating the tax laws or slowing down at work. I'm thinking of things like the Defiance campaign, right? That takes all these things that people had already been doing, them aims at the state. We see this in the Defiance campaign, as well as efforts to make South Africa ungovernable in the 1980s. We know too that Christian faith leaders like Albert Luthuli, or from Albert Luthuli to Desmond Tutu, played an important role in these efforts, offering a moral vision of this defiance. And we have celebrated as well what stayed hidden in defiance of apartheid, as well as the roles that Christians played in these efforts, funneling money, seeking people across borders, pushing back against these unjust laws in all kinds of ways. But if people channeled evasion into something truly remarkable to celebrate about South Africa's 20th century, what are some of its other consequences? How has this tight intertwining of Christianity and evasion perhaps also contributed to struggles with state capture and the rule of law? How can the dramatic growth of Christianity help us understand South Africa's major achievements and major struggles, as well as their links? And something I'm just beginning to explore and hope to think about more too. How might South Africa's history of Christianity have lessons for the rest of the world about these tight linkages too? So thank you. Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. For a very interesting presentation. Now we open the floor for questions and comments. If you're online, you can either raise your hand and be allowed to speak, or you can type your question in the Q&A section. So we'll start with the room. You have any questions?
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
And I find it really amazing that without their ability to read, and I know I am Catholic.
Yeah.
I know that, that some of the Protestant groups are. Will say, "Oh, Catholics they don't read the Bible." But here's somebody in the Methodist tradition, and they can't read, and they still manage to find their way. It comes as quite amazing. I kind of, I don't know, I mean, personally as well, as sometimes think, I mean, it's like Christianity and beliefs, and they can make sense to on an everyday, on a day-to-day way of life, right? If it wasn't religion or faith, it'll still make sense as a way of life. So
no, I agree, and I think there's so much that's important about that. And the fact that he so as he is trying to figure out how he moves forward in a world where he's maybe memorized some biblical texts, but cannot read it himself, right? There are all these interesting partnerships he makes with younger people. So like young literate men, even young girls sometimes who can read for him and who can kind of give him access to the words of the Bible. And you can tell in those letters to the editor, like these are people who have deep knowledge of the Bible, right? And so they sort of they help him access it, right? But then even if this is something that starts off as like an anxiety in his life, it ends up becoming a way of reaching out to all of these other people who can't read either, right? And mission Christianity has become so linked with education in South Africa at this point, right? That it gives people who don't learn to read a way to say that they can be a good Christian too, right? And so the source of anxiety becomes, in fact, part of his charisma, his appeal, part of what is drawing all these people to him. Thank you.
Okay, Sarah, you can unmute and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. So I actually have two questions. One's really easy. I was just wondering if his wife and children followed him in Christianity. You mentioned the son did
Sarah, you can
inherit.
ask your question. You're unmuted.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
She's talking. Should I just try it through my computer? Should I turn up my volume? Maybe. Yeah. Okay. Maybe. No. Is your volume up on your computer?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. I had two questions. One's easier and less in depth. I was just wondering, did his wife and children follow? It sounds like at least one son did because he inherited.
Yeah.
But did his wife and children follow, wives and children follow him in Christianity?
Great question.
And I was also wondering, so recently in the class that I am taking, we learned about totems in South Africa and their society and stuff. And I was wondering, with your knowledge, do you feel that Shembe could have found a balance between totemism and Christianity like he did with polygamy and bride wealth, that he wouldn't have needed to be so evasive the whole time?
Great questions. Thank you. So fascinatingly, he does one reason. So he buys land for all kinds of reasons. And land, I didn't get to talk about it today, but land in South Africa, if you're an African landowner at this time, it also helps you do things like evade unfair taxes, right? So he buys this land where he sets up this mission station. But one driving force is that, it kind of haunts him that he's left his family behind. And so he brings, I think one of his wives has died by this point, but he brings his surviving two wives, not the for a brief amount of time fiance, but the surviving two wives and his surviving children to live on the land that he buys. And so they grow up living at church headquarters. And the story that they tell is that these wives now live as like his sisters. But you can see this tension as he's reaching out to rural women and children who have been left behind, right? That the story of him leaving his own wives and children behind might be something that's hard for him to explain. And so not only does he care deeply about his family too, but his ability to sort of provide for them on this land that's at church headquarters helps make the point that yes, he had to make this break, but then he still wanted to take care of them. And then will you tell me more about Totoism? I don't know what this is, so I want to think about it and then answer your question when I know what it is.
Oh, I'm sorry. So again, I am just a student, so I'm not an expert in it, obviously. But the way that it was described to me is that it's part of their kinship, and one of their kinships is their totem for their family.
Totem,
and usually,
totem. Sorry.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Does that make sense then?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I heard it as Totoism.
Oh, the dog. No, sorry, totem.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. What's interesting, so there are parts of Southern Africa that have strong associations with totems. The area around what becomes the Zulu kingdom doesn't have those same totem associations. But what I will say is there's a way that over time, there is all this interest in genealogy and ancestors. And there is a way that over time, after Isaiah Shembe's death, the church absorbs a lot of that too. And so I think that you see sort of parallel ideas and institutions becoming part of what the church is addressing. And this is especially as under that second prophet, a lot of the members of the church are people who have left rural areas behind and are now living in apartheid era townships. And they, as we all would, have kind of nostalgia for what's lost. And so it's in that moment when things related to ancestors and something closer to like totems also becomes a part of the Nazareth faith. So thank you.
Thank you.
Now the question. So for me, not knowing much about South Africa, but I have read a little bit about Christianity, the arrival of Christianity and the people who are trying to convert. I'm just wondering, did they raise this aspect of Christianity as being a religion of the invaders? How did it play? And with the system of apartheid too?
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, great question. Certainly that is one critique of Christianity, that it is this religion of white people, right? But there's this contradiction in the scholarship that what you see very early on is that like missionaries are not very successful, right? And that there are people showing up at the mission station to engage in trade and not to convert. And it is the sort of earliest African, not even sometimes converts, but just people who have engaged with these ideas who are far more successful at spreading the faith, right? And so the role of the people who are doing much of the work of sharing knowledge of Christianity, the fact that they themselves are often Africans, I think pushes back against some of that, invader religion discourse that nevertheless will surface every once in a while. But they themselves too, I mean, they convert, they live in square houses, they get jobs that involve literacy. I mean, there's a way that they try to set themselves apart from the people around them too. And there is a lot of tension as a result between Africans who have converted to Christianity and Africans who haven't. And so to go back to John Dubé and Isaiah Shembe live next to each other and in some ways hate each other, but have to figure out how to get along with each other because of these tensions of like class, what makes an appropriate Christian, and who best embodies the faith.
Yeah, and you talked about Shembe being rich.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So, So he buys more land than any other African in all of South Africa in the 1910s and 1920s. And he makes it very clear, though, there are all these ways that he sort of tries to show off this wealth. Like he'll travel around with large bags of coins, which you might be like, that seems like kind of a hassle. But it shows that he's not taking the money and he's also not putting it in a bank account. He's not hiding it somewhere. Like he's got it as people have given it to him, right? But he does pay for his sons to go to very good schools. He does pay to provide for his wives who have moved, but he doesn't do things like he never buys himself a fancy motor car, and this is one kind of marker of being a wealthy person at this time for white and Black people, right? So he's like abstemious for himself, even as he buys for his family. But as a result of this, and this is wild, so like in South Africa at this time, if you were an African, like the Governor General of South Africa had to sign an order to say that you could get a loan from a bank, not because you needed the money, but maybe because you had so much money that you wanted to sort of move it around in different ways or take advantage of low interest loans. And he has enough money that he is able to get those orders signed, so that he can start doing kind of different things with his finance. But he has to walk this really difficult balance of using that money, showing how he's using it, and not seeming like he's using too much of it for himself. Yeah.
Okay, online, any other questions or comments? Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Very insightful and interesting.
Thank you.
Well, a follow-up question related to the previous question, that of Sarah, I think.
Yeah.
I would like to know to what extent was Shembe's religion or Christianity syncretic?
Yeah, great question. So I do think it becomes that, but I think it becomes syncretic in part because of the various strategies of evasion that I'm describing as he's navigating this world. So like South Africa is like, you know, a land of counterfactuals. What would have been if you had been white? What would you have been able to do? You know, if you'd been able to speak English, if you'd had a couple years of education, right? And I really think that Shembe starts out the revivalists that he's first exposed to buy a piece of land. They're white. They buy a piece of land. They open a divine healing center on that piece of land, and they invite people to come 4 times a year to be prayed over, you know? And I really think so. Also, this interest in buying land that he has comes a little bit from that as well. I think that if he had been able to act as he wanted to, that's like probably what he would have done. You know, he would have set up his own divine healing center where people could just come to him. Because he can't, because there are all these limits placed on him because of his race and class and everything else. He has to make partnerships with chiefs who are worried about witchcraft, right? And he himself might have been worried about witchcraft too, but like witchcraft comes into the church as a concession that he makes when he's saying to chiefs whose support he desperately needs, right? To offer him a place where he can sort of hold worship. You know, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine, essentially, right? And so I think a lot of, and like polygyny too, I see this as something like, yes, the church had been more permissive about ideas of marriage and who could be a good Christian, but it's in this moment of vulnerability when he has to turn to Southern Zulu land that we see things like polygyny become more institutionalized in the church, right? And so I think that the syncretism comes from him navigating this world and figuring out how to operate in it, not something he sort of sets out to do.
He had 3 wives, right?
He had 3 wives and was engaged to a 4th for a while, which is also remarkable. I mean, to go back to this issue of wealth, I've looked at the census records from this time where he's living, and they are looking at Africans' marriages. And like, who knows how good those numbers are, but no matter how good they are, so few African men have that many wives in this region at that time, right? And so it is potentially an indication that he had been a fairly successful farmer, even in these really, really difficult circumstances. Or it's also a sadder way to read it too, is that because he had had so many children die, he was hoping to have a wife with whom he would have living children, right? So it could be an indication of his wealth, or it could be an indication of something else. But yes, I think his different background also opens up pathways for that syncretism to come in, but it's more of his navigating the world that he's navigating. So thank you. Can I ask a question of y'all, actually? Is that okay? So I'm trying to think about this idea of evasion in Christianity, right? And there's so much in the Bible as a religion that incubates in a Roman Empire that is antagonistic to it, right? So there's like Nicodemus who struggles to make his faith public. There's a point where Jesus says, you know, it's okay if you pray in secret, right? There are also other faith traditions that have, you know, allow for secret practices. Islam, there's some circumstances in which you're allowed to hide your faith. Just like when I say like evasion in Christianity, I mean, how do y'all assess those terms together in terms of like how you think about these relationships, you know, even before the talk, right? This idea that, you know, you should evade to practice your faith or practice your faith in a certain way. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I thought it's interesting because even within Christianity,
Yeah.
you get even messages from Jesus, right?
Right,
And
right.
it's like in some cases, you know, they give you know, the parable of the poor woman who goes gives just a little money and talks about the Pharisees, how they want to stand in public places and profess, and
Yeah.
and it's in some cases, you know, do it quietly, don't show off with your religion.
Yeah.
But in other cases, it's like,
Yeah.
don't hide your light under bushel or something.
Yeah.
So even within Christianity itself, it kind of makes sense. And then you have that dimension where there's a sense of persecution,
Right,
where it's necessary.
Right.
So
Yeah.
So you can see the difference where in cases where it's necessary, it's just
Yeah.
for survival, right? You
Yeah,
need
yeah.
to do it to survive in the environments that you're in.
Yeah.
But in the other circumstances, do you wear it on your sleeve?
Right.
Or do you
Right.
just practice it quietly? So,
Right. And that's part of the power of a text like the Bible is that there are both messages, right? Like you hide it and you share it. And and there are circumstances when we understand you would need to do one or the other, right? No, so absolutely. No, thank you. It's something I've talked to other people, faculty in my department who study indigenous counters in North America with Christianity. And I'm curious to know comparable instances of these kinds of patterns of hiding the faith, right? Or of kind of mission Christianity sort of playing out in a way where people would hide and sneak when they were first experimenting of it. So I'm like constantly looking not just chronologically for comparative examples like the origins of Christianity, but other circumstances in, the 19th century where you might see similar dynamics at play too. Mormons are actually a great example too of some hiding and sneaking going on as well, but in a little bit of an earlier period. But yeah.
Islam, the religion itself, with Prophet Muhammad, it really started with hiding.
Mm-hmm,
for a very long period of time, people who follow Prophet Muhammad had to hide.
mm-hmm.
It's only when they had the help of one disciple that really had power,
Mm-hmm.
then now it was allowed.
Yeah.
So at first you have to hide till you have the strength of a community to get it out.
That's
But
fascinating.
otherwise, it started as you hide it.
Right.
And then
Right.
they even have to migrate.
Right.
Just
Right.
like it's almost as you have to wait until you have the power
That's fascinating.
before you can speak up or show it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like you said, at one point, mainly when they become powerful, then it was kind of looked down to hide.
Right. Right.
Because now you have the
Right.
community, you're strong.
Right.
yeah.
So you should show it to bring more people.
Right.
But not to hide it. But at the very beginning, it was.
Yeah. There's also like the crypto Judaism as well in the Inquisition, right? There are all these really difficult periods where we see faiths go underground too. But I guess I saw Sarah's hands up again. So.
Go ahead, Sarah. I think you didn't talk.
Yeah, sorry. I guess I was just my input on it was that it almost unfortunately seems a part of human nature for a religion in general have to hide because I mean the obvious World War II. So it's not just Christians, and it just unfortunately it does seem to be a part of human nature that we don't like what we don't know. And so somebody always has to hide, and that is unfortunate. But that's just kind of my thoughts on that. When you were saying with Christianity and evasion, I know you weren't saying it's just Christians, but it's just it's like there seems to be somebody always evading somebody.
Yeah, right. There are all these other chapters. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.